All right. Hello, everybody. I am Kathleen McGee from Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. It is so great to see such nice attendance, and I see faces I don't recognize. So for people who have not been here before, welcome to our speaker series. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what FOMB does. I'm just getting over a lost voice and still have this thing in my chest, so I will spare you from my longer version of the truth. So I just want to go over a couple things. FOMB is a very kind of eclectic organization. We do a lot of different things, and I'd like to think we do them well. Research and advocacy we do. We're working on an issue right now down on the Brunswick with a dam that's being taken down, a license being revoked, not revoked, but given up in exchange for 2 dams upstream that may not have fish passage now in our lifetime. So we're trying to have that not happen. We have several pieces of, we're a conservation group, we are a land trust, and we have several parcels in the pipeline right now, so we're working on that, and that's a continual thing that we do. And education and outreach we do with mostly elementary school kids. We work a lot with 4th and 5th graders, but this last year we've expanded to kindergarten right straight through to junior high school, and it's been really great and rewarding, and we reach about 2,000 kids in the schools every year. And then we also have 2 events that we do every year called Bay Day, where we get kids out onto the bay, where we have people here who have volunteered for that, and where we get them out from under the lights and away from their devices and their phones and their iPads, and get them out digging in the mud and building wigwams and doing beach seining and fish printing, and they have a blast, and we get them kind of reconnected to planet Earth a little bit. So anybody who's interested in that, please give me a shout if you want to before you go, and maybe we can hook you in with that, because we have a lot of volunteers who are great with that. We also do water quality monitoring every year. We're just about to start our program for this next year. We have training in March. We start in April and we go through October. And we do a lot on the Androscoggin, where we have been trying to upgrade that river now for I can't count how many years, but it's been a long time. It's been close to a decade, probably, and certainly active with that for the last 6 years. And we have all the good numbers. We just have to convince the legislature that it's the right thing to do, and by law, it's the only thing to do. So we'll keep working on that. And anybody who's interested in that, also just give me a shout. Just stop me before you go out the door, and we'll try to get you hooked up with that as well. So research and advocacy, conservation, education, and then we do these outreach. Educational outreach with adults as well, not just kids. So we do a speaker series that starts in October and goes through May, and that's where you are right now. Patagonia helps us defray some of the costs. It costs about $1,000 a year to do this, and they donate to us, which we then raffle off to you. A Patagonia, this time it's a nice plush, cozy pullover, and in order to win that, if you will just write your name on this slip of paper, just put it in this basket, and you put the money right in this little guy. Actually, you can put the money there, money in the basket, and then you put your name in here. And I will pass that around. It's great if it's at least $5, that would be helpful. As people have heard me say here who come more often, a $1,000 check, it will not be turned down. So we do take checks. We actually really do take checks. So that will get you. We'll do the raffle at the very end, and then somebody will walk away with that. So, and then I'm going to just start a sign-up sheet that goes around. It helps us figure out how many people come to each thing so that we can offer those things that are most interesting to the community. So we know when we have 45 or 55 or 100 people, we probably want to do more of those speaker series. And when we have 5, we kind of figure out that maybe that would be something we'll pass up next time. Next month, we will be doing on April 12th, cougar recovery in eastern North America. What did you want me to say?
Bring back the legend.
Bring back the legend. So, cougar recovery in eastern North America, bring back the legend. So we will try to, so come back so you can help us bring back the legend. And that, again, is April 12th, and that's going to be a really good one, too. The next couple are actually really, really good. So keep us in mind. If you're not a member, there's plenty of stuff over there you can take with you, and you can sign up with us. So I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight. Harper Botsford is museum assistant at the Tate House in Portland, historic home of George Tate, senior Mast agent for the Royal Navy in the 1700s. Batsford received his bachelor's degree in history from University of Southern Maine in 2015 and has a passion for engaging the public in local history. His work at the museum focuses on collections, restoration, and development, and he has been at the museum for 6 years. So please welcome Harper, and I think it's going to be a great show tonight. And I will give you this. Oh, yeah. The trade-off. Yeah.
All right, now that I'm covered in technology, thanks for coming out tonight. It's really great to see such a good crowd. And
Get closer to that microphone.
all right, is this working better? All right, pull that a little closer to me.
Maybe raise it up a little bit more.
Yeah.
All right.
Is that a little bit better?
Yeah, that's a little better. There we go. Okay. Oh. Sorry, I think it was a one-time thing.
Back of the microphone.
All right. I won't hold it against the microphone, I guess. All right. So have any of you guys heard about Tate House before, or George Tate, or the Mast trade? Hands? All right. Good. Good handful of hands. So you have any of you actually been to Tate House? Great. You probably saw me there. As she said, I've worked there for 6 years. So Tate House is really one of the few colonial buildings open to the public in the greater Portland area. But what gives it its historic significance is its connection to the Mast trade. So George Tate, as you may or may not know, was the last Mast agent for the province of Maine. There were really only two in this area, but he came here in 1750 to take over an operation that was pretty thoroughly established by Thomas Westbrook. And I'm just going to talk to you guys tonight about the significance of the Mast trade and a little bit about the greater impact of logging and the timber economy in this area. So it had some economic, social, and political ramifications that go right up until the Revolutionary War. So when you talk about the colonial world of the 17th and 18th century, we're really talking about a timber economy. We're talking about a world that relies on wood, not just for building ships' masts, but for heat, for all the new construction, and it was a vital resource. The average family went through 30 to 40 cords of wood a year in New England. That was actually really high compared to European families, just because they had this bounty. People actually kept fires going year-round. European visitors were actually pretty startled to see the amount of wood that New England colonists went through. So just to give you a visual of that amount, 30 to 40 cords of wood, that's a stack that is 4 feet high, 4 feet tall, and 300 feet long. So that's the annual consumption for one room, so one family, sorry. So they would have had to clear an acre of forest a year to supply one family. Settlers clearing land to build their homes and to start their farms saw the timber trade as a profitable byproduct of settlement, but it also became a major incentive for settlement. It was, in Maine, especially one of the primary industries alongside fishing. In a colonial economy, they're established primarily for extractive industries where you're taking resources from the land, and those are the resources we have here. So going back to why Britain came here in the first place. So Great Britain, if any of you have been to anywhere in the UK today, you'll notice even still there's it's a much more barren landscape than we have here in Maine. There's not many great forests. As early as the 13th century, Britain was stripped of substantial forests beyond royal preserves. They had to go to other countries to get the massive amounts of wood that were necessary to build their ships. They had good English oak that was great for building the body of the ship, but for the ship's mast, they needed tall pine or fir trees that held a lot of sap, grew straight and tall, and were supple and flexible to be on a ship. So the ship needed several masts. They, sorry, I just got behind in my notes. Some 18th century ships needed 3 lower masts, 3 top masts, 3 top gallant masts, a number of yards, a bowsprit, and a jib boom. They all needed to be made of this soft wood to save weight on the ship so that they could go faster. Obviously, the taller you can get a mast to be, the faster the ship will go. And for the first-rate warships that Britain's trade and naval supremacy required, the minimum for their masts, for their lower masts, would be 36 inches in diameter at the base, and they would be 120 feet tall. So they were going into the Baltic region for years and years, but there was a lot of competition. See, I haven't tried to use this pointer, so we'll see how it goes. There we go. Okay, so Great Britain is over here on this map, and you're coming up through, you have to go through these straits between Norway and Sweden and get into these ports. So it's, those countries had a lot of control over trade in that area. England was also competing with the Dutch, with Spain and France. They were all trying to get masts out of this area. So it became very expensive. There were a lot of bribes involved. There were a lot of fees involved and taxes. So they really, they also had to travel by armored convoy often. If there was war going on, as there often was, in the 18th century and late 17th century, Britain had several wars with the Dutch. Those ports would close and they would not have access to the masts that they needed to conduct trade and also war. So that's why the New World really presented a great opportunity for Britain in terms of mast resources, and they started popping up right around the 1630s was when the first cargo of masts arrived from the New World. And that early 17th century mast trade really focused around the Piscataqua River region. They were used during the Dutch War. From 1712 to 1718, England received 638 great masts, 262 middling, and 88 small masts from the New England trade. So there was a lot of money to be made there, and New Hampshire merchants were there to take advantage of that opportunity. They were also, because of their state's independence, New Hampshire had a little bit more independence from Great Britain than the Massachusetts Bay colony, they were able to kind of skirt around some of the regulations surrounding white pines that were being used. So let's actually just jump ahead and talk about some of those regulations. Actually, I don't think I have a slide for that. But so starting in 1720, the Royal Navy started passing acts of parliament that would control the access to white pines that were of size for ships' masts. So that would be any ship that was 2 feet in diameter or wider if at 12 feet up from the base of the tree. So first they claimed any tree of that size not on private property, and then eventually the laws became stricter and stricter and claimed any white pine as property of the crown, given that it wasn't on private property. There was a lot of logging going on, that being said, on public lands or on unclaimed lands, because there were just so few officials there to oversee it. In New Hampshire, particularly, local government officials were often also, families like the Wentworths who were participating in the mast trade themselves, so they stood to profit from turning a blind eye to those skirting around the law in terms of the regulations. So, all right. So, in 1727, the mast trade kind of moved towards Portland, and which at the time was called Falmouth, and encompassed a greater area of land. That move was made by Colonel Thomas Westbrook, who had received the office of mast agent for the Royal Navy in 1709. He came up here in 1727, noticing that there was a pretty marked depletion of resources in the Portsmouth area. People had to go 30 to 40 miles inland just to get firewood. Over the course of 100 years, they really had pretty thoroughly depleted the resources in that area. So Portland, at the time that Westbrook came, was undergoing a population boom. It was a brief time of peace, and New Englanders came north looking for land, commerce, and a chance to get some of the money that was in the timber trade. That being said, the mast trade was really only profitable for a very, very few people that had the means and the connections and the licenses from the Crown to harvest those trees, but there was a lot of work to be found in that industry, even if you weren't at the top. So when Thomas Westbrook came to Falmouth, he kind of copied the Portsmouth gentry and built his home, Harrow House, which he styled as a manor, but it was effectively a garrison. The land, there was still a lot of concern about French and Indian raids in the area, and his home was a pretty defensible fortress, as many of the homes in the area were. When George Tate came in 1750, he really built more of almost a townhouse style structure in Portland, and it's just a sign of how the area was developing, this population boom really resulted in Portland becoming more of a refined area, and the Mast trade was one of the major economic factors behind that. So just getting back to, let's see if I can get slides caught up. All right, so this is an example. This is Samuel Waldo, who was a partner of Thomas Westbrook. Obviously, he was involved in a lot of other trade aside from the Mast trade, but he was one of the few that profited from it very greatly. And then there was a lot of industry going on the lower level of getting the masts in from the woods down to the Fore River and out into Casco Bay, where they were going to England's shipbuilding cities. So all right. So getting these masts out to the river, out of the woods into the river, was described by one New Hampshire visitor to Falmouth as a very notable sight. He said there were about 32 yoke of oxen and about 4 yoke by the side of the mast between the fore and hinder wheels. They took huge teams of oxen and were carried in the winter on sleds, and in the spring they were carried on 14-foot high mast wheels that were hung, the masts were hung by those wheels by chains. And so it, excuse me. Okay. So in addition to the ox goaders and the men leading the masts in from the interior, they employed woodcutters, ox goaders, mast wrights, who hewed the logs at the mast house, men to clear the roads, soldiers to guard the mast parties during the War of 1744 to 1748, stevedores to load and unload ships, and additionally mast ships were in town for a long time, employing people at inns, people serving food, and providing for the ship and crew of the mast ships. And here are just a few more of the tools involved in the mast trade. So here you can see on the banks of the Fore River, they would be stripped of their bark. They would be cut with a draw shave like this over here till they have 16 sides, and then would be floated down the river to deeper water where these giant mast ships, which would hold 15 to 18 masts at a time, and head over to England's shipbuilding cities. All right, so the mast trade was a pretty contentious issue in colonial Falmouth and all of southern Maine and New Hampshire. Here is our lovely picture of Falmouth Neck burning in 1778, and that was one of the eventual consequences of the mast trade, actually. So going back, we have this extractive process where Great Britain is taking wood out of Maine's forests that cannot be cut down and sold for lumber. It can't be used for any of the purposes that would stimulate the economy in New England. It's going to shipbuilding cities in the New World, in the Old World, where and pretty much stifling any progress they were not encouraging shipbuilding in New England. They were there was not access to this great resource that would have been a lot of income for people because not everyone could have the licenses with the Crown. So that was actually one of the reasons that people around this area got behind the revolution. It was even before people were getting angry about the Stamp Acts, people were clashing with the surveyors that were going into Maine's woods and marking trees as property of the Crown. The fine for cutting down one of these trees without permission was 100 pounds, but the profit that could be made was much greater. In the height of the Mast boom in 1756, the largest mast could go up to 218 pounds. But there was also not as much of a market for ships' masts. People in New Hampshire often sold to Spain and Portugal, but in Maine, the only option really was to sell to the Royal Navy, and they obviously would not purchase masts that were felled illegally. So people were really angry about missing out on that opportunity for profit, and oftentimes felled the trees illegally and hid them. There were some cases of people hiding them in rivers for a few years until the heat died down, and really just kind of doing everything they could to circumvent the mast, the white pine laws. So fast forward to after several decades of this rebellious activity, which was sometimes called the Woodlands Rebellion. Falmouth, in that way and in many others, had received a reputation as they were called Boston's little sister in rebellion, and were the northernmost point on what was supposed to be a series of naval bombardments of rebellious cities on the coast, and ended up actually being the only city that was bombarded by Captain Mowat's fleet, pretty much burning the entire peninsula. So we have our illustration here, just to get back to the beginning of that story. So we have some of the political repercussions of the mast trade. There were also some environmental repercussions of not just the mast trade, but the widespread deforestation that actually came a little bit later as cities started to develop more and put a larger strain on agricultural resources. The land clearing that farmers had to do to set up their farms actually became very damaging to environmentally as well. There was actually a warming effect of cleared lands that was documented by 18th century naturalists, where caused by the exposure of the land to the elements. So there's, excuse me. So there was land warming. There was also the land was unable, because it didn't have the root systems from the forests, to absorb the water runoff from melting snow in the winter and from spring rains, and there were actually swellings of rivers. There was an increase in incidences of flood, and there was actually some speculation among historians that there was a correlation between the clearing of land for farms and sickness caused by larger amounts of standing water relating to increased insect population, which brought in diseases. So, yeah. All right, excuse me. All right, yeah, so, sorry, I just skipped over one thing with the environmental impacts also. There was also a change in the soil chemistry. One of the reasons that farmers would, when they first cleared land, think they had really good soil, and then once that land had been cleared for a few years, because the forest system that was in place had completely been removed, the chemistry of the soil changed, became very dry, and farms were really struggling with that sudden, what they saw as sudden change of their soil after deforestation. So I've kind of covered the bases of the Mast trade, its political and economic and environmental impacts. I'd really like to open up for a discussion and just kind of go off of what your interests are. This is definitely not all I have, but I'd like for the rest of the night to be kind of more discussion-based if anyone has any questions. Yes?
There was noted that there was still a brought out arrow pine in Hiram up to around 40 years ago. Do you know any history of that?
I know there are lots of rumors of broad arrow pines. I think they're pretty hard to authenticate. If we go back, just all right. So if we go back to this slide, this is up here. This is the broad axe that it's a later axe, but it didn't change too much. That would have been used to make the broad arrow marks on the white pines. That would have marked them as king's pine. So they're hard to authenticate. I know there's an organization that keeps track of. I think they award like largest tree recorded every year, but I don't know if there are any that have really thoroughly been authenticated. Yes?
A slide that may have been right before this one was showing the, yeah, that's the one on the right, showing the logs being hauled, and it is kind of illustrative of the fact that they, the logs couldn't essentially turn the corner. But I can't think of any town squares that have oddball shapes, as they say that there is some. Do you know of any?
Yeah, I'm kind of, these are illustrations that were made by Samuel Manning in the 70s for a PBS special on Maine's logging heritage, and I think this might be some kind of artistic license. The Mast roads that went in from that starts in modern day Falmouth and goes into Portland and is still an active road today. It was, or parts of it are, was created as to be a fairly straight shot because they couldn't turn easily. I mean, you're right, it's this huge feat of engineering to get these masts. There were actually instances where oxen strangled going down hills because they didn't have sufficient chains to counteract the weight of the mast going downhill. So it was a pretty dicey thing for sure.
Behind here is suggesting that Freeport might be such a town.
At the turn at L.L. Beans was called Broad Turn, I think, at one time. It's not that way anymore. I think they filled it in, but it was wide at one time.
There's a road called Lower Mast Landing Road.
Yes. Yeah. So a lot of the infrastructure established for the Mast trade eventually did turn into roads, and I'm unfortunately pretty Portland specific with my knowledge.
Actually, do you know how much those logs weigh typically?
They could be 1 to 2 tons. They are even maybe some of them could be.
They're about probably 5,000 pounds,
Yeah.
maybe a little bit more.
Yeah. So like 2 to 3. Sorry, I just didn't have my number right up there. Yeah, so they were really huge to move. They were, at least 24 inches in diameter by 100 feet long. So they were really. It was. I know the Portland historian has referred to it as. Like watching a moon rocket launching, people would come out and watch the masts go through the towns. It was, there would be really only a couple ships going out per year, so it's not, and those would have 30 to 40 masts on them. So it's not a huge volume by what we think of with today's trade. It would be for them, and that's several thousand pounds of money pounds, not in terms of weight, that they were making for profit off of those. Yes.
I recognize these two sketches here.
Mm-hmm.
And this was done by somebody in the state of Maine.
Sam Manning.
And that booklet has 20 of these
Mm-hmm.
sketches, if anybody's interested in it. I don't know how you find them, but
Yeah. Well, we.
one at an old bookstore.
Yeah, we sell them at the Tate House Museum, not to sound like tacky, but if you ever want to get in touch with us there, we sell them for a really reasonable price. I don't know where, I think they're out of print now. We're actually might have to, we're at a point where we might have to get some reprinted.
They're online pretty easily.
They are?
Oh, really?
I bought one about 3 weeks ago.
Oh, good.
All right. Yeah.
I have a question about the logs themselves. How much stripping of the bark do they have to do before they arrived in England? How much did the English have to do to these things?
They came pretty much ready. One thing I'm unclear about is that they did spend a lot of time in water traveling. The primary method of transporting these masts whenever possible was to float them down rivers. They actually would send them over waterfalls even. So they did spend a lot of time in water, so they might have had to have some minor finish work when they got there. But they were cutting them down. I didn't include one of the other tools that they would have been using, which is a barking iron, which kind of looks like it's just this little circular iron thing on the end of a pole, just kind of primitive looking to peel the bark off of trees. So they would have been completely debarked. You can see there's kind of lines in this, and you're right, there's a whole series of illustrations that shows this process. I kind of made a little bit of a executive decision to just abbreviate it and just show some of the stages. But you can see they are cut into sections of, that's 6, right? Yeah. So they would be actually eventually end up with 16 sides, and they would be planed here. It was actually just happening right on there was a mast landing right on 2 miles up the mouth of the Fore River, and this would have been done pretty much directly in sight of the Mast agents. George Tate's house was on a hill overlooking where all this was going on. So, yeah, it was all done here. Yes?
This is probably a dumb question, but you're saying you're floating the logs, these huge trees down the river. Logistically, how do you get the mast onto the ship?
They actually had special ports. So this is a mast ship in the background in this. You can't quite see they had special ports built into the cargo hold of the ship. There was actually a winch on board, a man-powered winch that was on the deck of the ship, and then there would be men with a system of ropes and pulleys below to guide the ships, guide the masts onto the ships. And so it was pretty tough to get the masts onto the ships, but they had a system in place. And for getting the masts, from this stage into the river, they were actually, it's this process called twitching, where they basically just had planks that were pushed under the masts, and men would essentially roll them into the river.
Now, were the boats longer than the masts, I assume?
Yeah, they were huge.
Big boats,
Yeah,
relatively speaking.
they were massive boats, and massive and full of masts. So they would probably have been made. I had someone at the museum ask me, well, where do you get the masts for the mast ships? Because they were huge, larger than even maybe a man of war, and so they probably would have been compound masts, which was something that they had to resort to a lot of times when they did have timber shortages as well. So they had gotten pretty good at piecing together masts, and they would be banded with iron or assembled so that they could have a taller mast when they didn't have a taller tree. Yes?
You alluded to the Tate house relationship to the water. Could you talk a little bit about were the masts hauled right to the water below the Tate house, which I'm sure is not at all the same as it would have been in 1770, whatever?
Yeah. So there's a little bit of unknown with exactly where the mast landing was. As far as I know, we don't have like a firm location for precisely where it was, but it was in that area. It would have been, if not in eyesight, within walking distance of where George Tate was living. Harrow House, where Westbrook lived, was a little bit further out on that little on the little point that the Stroudwater neighborhood is on. So he probably wouldn't have been directly able to see it, but they would be right in the middle of it.
But the ships, it would not have been loaded there.
The ships, they could come in surprisingly far because they were pretty kind of flat-bottomed ships, but they would be a little bit further out. In the 18th century, they did dredge the Fore River and the Stroudwater River pretty frequently to allow ship passing. There was this whole canal system that kind of took off more in the 19th century there, but they did some, not landscaping, waterscaping, to allow ships passage, so they could get a little bit further than you would imagine today. Today it's kind of filled in a lot. Yes?
I can imagine wanting a flat-bottomed ship like that for exactly that reason. That would make complete sense. These are huge masts. They must have been very difficult to get on board. But then, I mean, didn't they have trouble once they got out to sea? I mean, they had no keel. They had no. I mean, wouldn't the ships be relatively? I mean, did they lose ships as they?
They were shallower than your average ship. They still had a keel, and they were not like a completely flat bottom. They were just kind of like a shallower.
In Europe, or that you know of?
I know there was a case of when Westbrook was in charge, he did lose a shipment of masts. I'm sorry, I don't know much more than that about it, but it definitely did happen, and it would have been a huge loss. I mean, if you have 2 shipments going out a year, to lose one, definitely. Yes?
I know that in places like Wisconsin, the shipping was still very vibrant, really up until the embargo of 1807. So what happens to after the Revolution to the Mast trade?
After the Revolution, the Mast trade, even before the Revolution, because there was all this antagonism toward Great Britain, the Mast trade kind of died off. We don't have a clear record. We don't have any really primary sources of, aside from a few account books from George Tate about how he dealt with that situation. The idea we kind of get is he was pretty old by then, and he kind of stayed out of the fray. But people definitely were not wanting to give. They're not handing cannon fodder to the people they're fighting. They're not giving that resource to Great Britain. After the Revolution, there was a little bit of a economic downturn for a little while, but eventually there was a pretty booming shipbuilding industry in New England that our forests did contribute to, and the 19th century logging boom is kind of even more extensive than the 18th century one. Was just kind of focused around coastal communities. They went really far inland, and that's why we have no old growth forests today. Sorry if that was a little bit. I feel like I skirted around your question a little bit, but I don't know too much about the 19th century in general. Yeah.
So these trees, how old were they when they were cutting them? And how far inland did they go to have to find them?
They would be close to 200 years. They could be. We have a cross section at the museum that's a little over. A little over 24 feet. I think it's like 28 inches, not feet. And that's about 200 years. So they're really people coming into the 19th or late 18th century landscape of New England. People from Old England were saying, wow, the soil's really barren here. Look at how small these trees are and how stifled the growth is. It was really just everything had been removed. Ed in the back?
Yeah, was it a good job to be off cutting these timbers, and how did you get to be a cutter, harvester? Was that?
Good question. So I know Samuel Knight was one of the big foresters for Westbrook's operation, and he got involved because he was Westbrook's nephew. But the men he oversaw, it was seasonal work. So I'm not entirely sure, but I think it would probably be something that would supplement, the slow season. They're working in the winter so that they can, or when they can, they're working in the winter so that they can use sleds instead of wheels because it's a little easier. So farming is generally slower than, so it was probably seasonal work for a lot of people.
Were people freelance, or did they all work for, several of the Westbrook or Tate or, the different agencies?
In order to be working on a mast clearing operation, you would have to be working directly or indirectly for Tate. They had a lot of different contractors that they were working with, and there were also a lot of people who were, in the timber trade who were cutting down these trees illegally as well. So Yeah, to be cutting down the mast trees, you would have had to be working for George Tate or Westbrook or someone like with a permit from one of the surveyors general, who were the actual kind of law in these terms. They were the ones who granted the permits, but there's a lot of other lot of lumber to go around. Yes.
Wasn't there a specific blaze characteristic? Was it a broad arrow? So do you know what it looked like?
Yeah. I'm just gonna grab something. Okay, no. Never mind, I don't have it. It was just 3 axe slashes. It looked kind of like a crowfoot. Don't have anything to actually draw with, but it's just... So it's just three slashes in the shape of kind of like an arrowhead.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah. That. And that was used, that was a really old symbol of anything that was the crown property. It was put on all sorts of trade goods. Yes?
I only remember very vaguely as a child being told that the Golden Pines were part of that operation. And I'm wondering if that's correct, and also whether it's known whether any masts have actually left from the Golden Pines right up the street from where we are here. Or do we know, or is it known? I mean, I don't know.
I can sort of answer that question. Those Bowden pines are not that old.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
They're only about 140 years old.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
There's some that are older, but they were second growth.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Why are they second growth? I mean, who took the first growth?
Well, it was farmed way back when.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And those were grown up in the late 1800s.
Oh, I see.
Or mid 1800s.
Yes?
I grew up in the Damascotta area, and there was a group of trees that we used to hear about and they called it the King's Pines.
Mm-hmm.
And I never went up to look at it, but I presumed that they were old.
Oh, the ones with the eagle's nest in it?
Yeah.
Yeah, those were big trees.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, the process of, I guess you can take cores out of living trees to count the rings and see their age, and there are other ways, less destructive ways probably, to tell the age of trees. But I don't know of any documented trees that go all the way back. But it's kind of one of those things that there's a lot of kind of like urban legend about it. It's definitely part of the history of the landscape.
So they did not keep records of where the trees came from?
No, they would have kept, the records were just kind of too general to say, like, specifically this tree was here. They would have written, I am sending Thomas Westbrook trees from this area, but it wouldn't necessarily be the specific, they didn't really have, they weren't, mapping specifically where they were clearing. It was pretty willy-nilly. Any other questions?
So we have some boards that we got out of our old garage when we tore it down, and the boards are 24 or 30 inches wide, and people can send them to the King's Pine. I don't know. That's what they're at least 50 years old or more than that. I mean, the garage is that when we tore it down.
Yeah. I mean, the size of the trees. I mean, you could have a tree 2 yards in diameter. I mean, it's just really hard to imagine by our standards. And that's why I was saying earlier, settlers were really able to be really picky about their wood, actually, because they had so much of it, and they actually, their sawmills were not able to process wood as quickly as they were able to cut it down, and they had so much of it, they I mean, sawmills at the time were either, one guy in a pit and one guy up above, or they were actually ahead of England in having water-powered sawmills in the 17th century. They actually, one of the first sawmills in New England was in York. So
I would guess that enforcement in those days was more symbolic than anything else. I mean, you could, all these people running around, and if the Crown wanted to enforce anything, you'd have to find somebody that you wanted to make an example of. I can't imagine that you could enforce things in a general, sort of sensible way. It had to become a real priority to enforce anything.
yeah, I mean, the colonial legal system was pretty, it's pretty, it's frontiers. It's the frontier. It was not a well-oiled machine by any term. It just is an example of how it doesn't have anything to do with the Mast trade, but George Tate's son actually was convicted of accidentally murdering his mother. It's a long story, but the trial took 3 years, and he had to go down to Salem for the trial. So, and he was just living his life. Totally could have fled to England. He actually did later flee to England to avoid debtor's prison. So yeah, it was a pretty haphazard legal system at the time, especially in this area.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.